Why did her hands tremble when she tightened her laces that morning? The sun had barely crested the Tennessee horizon, spilling gold across Fort Campbell's parade grounds, but Captain Sarah Mitchell felt no warmth in it. She walked with practiced posture, crisp uniform, boots hitting gravel in perfect rhythm. To anyone watching, she looked like the model officer. To anyone but her. There was a hesitation in her stride, subtle but there. A faint limp hidden behind discipline, like a secret tucked into every step. She had been dreading this day for weeks, not because of the test itself. Push-ups, sit-ups, the 2-mile run, she had conquered them countless times before, in dust-choked valleys of Afghanistan and under the weight of body armor heavier than she was now allowed to wear. No, it wasn't the test. It was what the test would reveal. Colonel James Harrison stood at the center of the field like a statue carved from scar tissue and steel. His voice thundered across the rows of assembled soldiers, a voice that carried not just command but judgment. He had ruled his units through intimidation for 30 years, and his weathered face bore the history of campaigns that had shaped him into the man Sarah dreaded crossing today. He saw weakness as a stain, one he would bleach out with shame if necessary. His reputation preceded him, uncompromising, merciless, and utterly intolerant of excuses. Sarah slid into formation, the knot in her stomach tightening. Around her, young soldiers whispered quietly, some shifting with nervous energy, others projecting confidence they may or may not have earned. She kept her face forward, expression neutral. She was good at that, pretending she belonged, even when her body told a different story. The colonel began barking names, assigning soldiers to their stations. The rhythm of military life, predictable as the metronome of a drill sergeant's boots. One by one, soldiers moved to push-ups, sit-ups, the running track. And then her name. Captain Mitchell. The syllables cut the air like a blade. She stepped forward, her spine locked into parade ground rigidity, but her left side betrayed her, the faintest drag of a boot, the smallest favor of her hip. Not enough for most to notice, enough for the colonel's eyes to narrow. The morning was cool, but sweat traced a line down her temple. The first station, push-ups, easy once. Muscle memory had carried her through hundreds before. She dropped into position, palms pressing into gravel, back straight. Soldiers formed a loose circle, their curiosity sharpened by the colonel's tone. The timer began. 1, 2, 3. Her arms obeyed at first, body rising and falling in rhythm, but each repetition carried a sting, a knife twisting deeper into her torso. The scar beneath her jacket, hidden for months, burned with every downward press. 15 seconds in, her body faltered, arms trembled, breathing shortened. She tried to force one more repetition, then another. The pain in her chest roared louder than her will. And then she collapsed. The silence that followed was louder than the colonel's voice had ever been. He stepped forward, his face shadowed, mouth already sharpening into a blade. He had seen this before, or thought he had. Soldiers who made excuses, who hid behind ailments, who wanted the uniform without the weight it demanded. On your feet, Captain. She pushed herself upright, chest heaving, pride the only thing holding her spine straight. Around her, soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Some stared openly. Sympathy in a few eyes, judgment in others. The colonel closed the distance, his voice low, cold, far more dangerous than when he shouted. Each word cut deliberately, the way a scalpel dissects weakness. Is this what passes for leadership, excuses, laziness, hiding behind phantom injuries? You set the standard for these young soldiers. And this, he gestured to her trembling arms, her labored breath, this is your standard. His words carried. Other units stopped to watch. A spectacle was forming. Sarah stood in the center of it, jaw clenched, every insult hitting harder than any round she had ever taken. Inside, she wanted to scream, to tell him the truth, to remind him of the missions, the firefights, the names etched into her memory, to explain why her chest ached with every breath, why her body betrayed her now after carrying her through hell. But she stayed silent. Military protocol demanded composure. Pride demanded restraint. And yet, silence cut deeper than his words. The colonel's voice rose, accusations striking like hammer blows. He painted her as weak, unfit, a liability. He suggested that her career, her presence, poisoned the very soldiers who looked to her for guidance. Sarah's eyes flicked to Sergeant Martinez, a soldier she had mentored since his first deployment. His expression broke her heart more than the colonel's insults ever could. Confusion, disappointment, the faint fracture of faith in his commanding officer. That look hurt worse than the scar across her chest. Her lungs burned. The scar throbbed beneath her jacket, every second stretched. She thought of her parents, her father who had stood proudly at her commissioning ceremony, her mother who framed every newspaper clipping. She thought of her younger sister, who still told her friends, "My sister's a captain in the U.S. Army." She thought of the soldiers who had followed her into combat, who had trusted her judgment when a wrong call could mean death. The colonel's words reached a crescendo. He declared her a liability, a cautionary tale of what happened when standards slipped. He spat her name like a warning to the others. The weight of 100 stares pressed down on her shoulders. She had faced enemy fire, mortar blasts, night raids through villages lit only by tracer rounds. She had dragged wounded comrades to safety with her own blood soaking her gear. And yet, this moment here, under the gaze of her peers, made her feel more vulnerable than any battlefield ever had. For one breath she considered surrender, letting the colonel's judgment stand, taking the easy path, a quiet transfer, a desk job somewhere, fade into obscurity, hide the truth until it no longer mattered. But then her eyes found Martinez again, his young face caught between doubt and loyalty, the soldier she had taught about integrity, courage, and standing tall when it mattered most. How could she expect him to be brave if she could not? The decision crystallized like ice in her veins. Her hands moved slowly to the front of her jacket. The simple action rippled through the crowd. Soldiers leaned closer, brows furrowed. Even the colonel faltered mid-sentence, caught off guard. This wasn't regulation. This wasn't protocol. She unfastened one button, then another, fingers trembling, not from fear but from the weight of truth pressing against her skin. The memory struck her as she worked down the row of buttons. Kandahar 8 months ago. The heat, the smell of diesel and dust, the heavy weight of her gear. The mission that had changed everything. The explosion. The way the blast had slammed her into concrete, shrapnel ripping through her chest. The days of bandages and morphine. The surgeon's voice, steady but tired. Some wounds will never heal clean. The final button came free. Sarah let her jacket fall open. Gasps cut the silence. Against the clean white of her undershirt, the scar glared like fire. Jagged, raised, running from her left shoulder toward her heart. Angry tissue that spoke of violence, of survival. The colonel's face drained of color. Every soldier in that circle saw it. A wound no excuse could fake. A story carved into flesh. Sarah stood still, letting silence do what words could not. The morning sun caught the scar, turning it into a beacon of sacrifice. For months she had hidden it, for herself, for others, for pride. But now, stripped bare before them all, she let it speak. The field held its breath. And in that stillness, something shifted. Why had she hidden it for so long? The scar caught every eye. Soldiers who had moments before judged her now stood frozen, their breath stolen by the raw truth carved across her chest. It was not the faint line of a minor accident, not the fading mark of a childhood scrape. This was something else entirely, an injury that had nearly stolen her life. Colonel Harrison's voice died in his throat. The words he had sharpened into weapons only moments earlier dissolved into ash. He had berated her, humiliated her, carved her dignity down to nothing. But the scar, it told a story no rank or rhetoric could erase. Sarah's breathing steadied as she stood exposed in the open air. She didn't fidget. She didn't speak. She let the silence hang heavy, let it draw every soldier closer without moving a step. Even Sergeant Martinez, the same young soldier whose doubt had wounded her most deeply, leaned forward now, his eyes wide, his face caught between reverence and regret. The colonel tried to form words, his lips parting once, twice, as if he could salvage his authority. But nothing came. Authority had already shifted, not to Sarah but to the scar, to what it represented. Her fingers brushed the edge of the wound absent-mindedly, the way someone might touch a medal on their chest, not proud, not ashamed, simply remembering, and memory, like shrapnel, cut sharp when it surfaced. Kandahar, 8 months earlier. The dust had been so thick it clung to her teeth, mixing with the acrid tang of diesel fuel from the Black Hawks that had dropped them outside the compound. The sun had blazed down like an unblinking eye, unmerciful, baking every ounce of energy from the air. Sarah had led from the front, rifle in hand, radio tight against her ear, eyes scanning walls where shadows hid potential threats. Intelligence had been clear. Their target was high value, a man responsible for orchestrating multiple attacks on coalition patrols. He had slipped through their grasp for weeks, always one step ahead, always leaving bodies in his wake. Now, at last, they had him cornered, or so the intel said. Her squad moved like water through the compound's maze of walls and narrow alleys, boots striking dirt, hands signaling silently, every breath measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the mission. And then the explosion. It came not with warning but with violence absolute. A blast wave slammed her into concrete, her body weightless for a split second before crashing back down. Dust filled her mouth, her ears rang with static, her chest. Oh, her chest. It felt like something inside had torn loose. Voices shouted, gunfire cracked, the world spun. She remembered trying to push herself upright, pain lancing through her ribs. A glance down, blood soaking through her vest, shrapnel, burning, cutting, lodged deep. But her squad was pinned. Screams cut through the chaos. Martinez's voice panicked, young, calling for orders. Without thinking, she ignored the pain. She forced air into her lungs, each breath a war in itself. Move left flank, Martinez with me. She staggered forward, vision narrowing, heart hammering so violently she wondered if it would burst. But she held her rifle steady, fired bursts where shadows shifted, pulled one soldier by his vest out of the kill zone. Every second was stolen, every action paid for in pain. She remembered the sting of adrenaline, the way it masked nothing but made her faster. She ordered air support, called out enemy positions, and refused evacuation until every single one of her soldiers was accounted for. It wasn't heroism, it was duty, a duty that didn't care if her body was breaking apart. By the time medics dragged her onto the evac bird, she had nearly blacked out. She remembered looking down once just before they lifted off. The compound smoldered in ruins, enemy fire silenced, her squad alive. Her last clear thought before darkness took her, they made it, that's enough. In the present, standing on the training ground, her chest rose and fell slowly as the memory faded. Her hand still hovered near the scar, tracing the ridge where hot steel had carved through flesh. The soldiers around her whispered, not gossip, not mockery, but reverent awe, like they were in the presence of something greater than themselves. Even the veterans, the ones who had seen combat scars before, nodded quietly. They understood the weight of what she had endured. Colonel Harrison's hands twitched at his sides. His own chest lifted with an involuntary breath, as if he could feel the ghost of her pain inside his own body. His long career had given him scars too, but nothing like this. Not this kind of permanent reminder. He swallowed hard, his posture faltering, the iron mask of his authority beginning to crack. For months, Sarah had hidden this truth, waking early every morning to button her jacket just so. Perfect creases, perfect posture, nothing to reveal the battle beneath her skin. She had smiled at her soldiers, briefed them with calm assurance, laughed when duty allowed. and always she had carried the weight of silence. But silence had broken her here, in front of them all. And now the scar spoke in ways her words never could. Her voice finally came steady, almost clinical. 8 months ago, Kandahar province. We were after a target who had killed too many of our people. We found him, but he had prepared for us. An IED, shrapnel, close enough that the surgeons spent hours pulling pieces from my chest, some they couldn't remove. She let the words hang. They were not excuses, not justifications, just truth. I refused evacuation until my squad was clear. Every one of them made it home. That was the mission. That was my job. Silence followed, not disbelief, not doubt, but respect. The colonel's shoulders slumped slightly. His earlier thunder seemed almost obscene now, out of place in the shadow of the truth. His lips pressed together, then parted. The words that emerged were not barked commands, but something closer to a confession. I didn't know. Sarah's eyes locked on his. For the first time, she saw not just a superior officer, but a man confronted with his own failure of judgment. His voice had lost its power, his authority stripped bare by the raw evidence of her survival. But Sarah didn't gloat, didn't lean on his weakness. She simply let the scar speak for her. Around them, soldiers shifted. One by one, they straightened their posture. A ripple of quiet honor moved through the circle. Sergeant Martinez stepped closer, his face a mixture of awe and guilt. Tears shimmered in his eyes, the realization of what she had carried, what she had endured without complaint. And then, without a word, he lifted his hand to his brow, a crisp salute. The gesture spread like fire. One by one, soldiers raised their hands, salutes crisp, faces solemn, until Sarah stood at the center of a silent circle of respect, every head turned toward her not in judgment but reverence. Colonel Harrison stood still, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Authority had shifted indeed, not to him, not anymore. Sarah's scar glistened in the morning sun, a story of survival carved deeper than any words could etch. She let it shine, let it remind every soldier there strength was not the absence of wounds. It was the will to keep standing with them. The field held its breath. And Sarah knew this was only the beginning. What did it feel like? The moment her body gave up but her mind refused to. Sarah had replayed that night in Kandahar more times than she could count. Not because she wanted to, because her body refused to let her forget. Each time her scar burned, each night her breath caught in her chest like a knife, the memory resurfaced with merciless clarity. The explosion had torn through their mission like a storm. She remembered the heat first, not the heat of fire, but the shockwave pressing her lungs flat, suffocating her as she hit the wall. Her ears rang, her vision swam, her mouth tasted like iron and dirt. And then silence. Silence that lasted just long enough for terror to creep in before the screaming began. Gunfire followed, enemy fire from rooftops, muzzle flashes blinking through the dust. Her squad was pinned, scattered, voices overlapping on the radio. Martinez's voice cracked with panic, barely audible through the ringing in her ears. "Captain orders. Captain, what do we do?" Her body screamed for stillness. Her chest throbbed, ribs grinding, every breath a war. But duty pulled her upright. She forced herself onto her knees, one hand clutching her vest where blood leaked through. With the other, she raised her rifle. Left flank move now. Martinez, cover fire. Her own voice startled her, stronger than she felt. It carried authority she didn't know she still had. Her soldiers moved, hesitant at first, then with precision as training took over. She pushed forward, dragging one soldier by his collar out of the blast zone, teeth clenched against the fire burning through her chest. The target compound erupted in chaos. Doors burst open. Shadows poured out with rifles. Sarah fired until her magazine clicked empty, then reloaded with hands slick with blood. She knew she was hit badly. The shrapnel had dug deep, each breath a reminder that her chest cavity wasn't whole anymore. But if she fell, they would fall with her, and she couldn't let that happen. Minutes stretched like hours. Air support finally arrived, the scream of jets overhead followed by the thud of ordnance obliterating enemy positions. Dust clouds rose higher. Silence crept back in, broken only by groans of the wounded and the crackle of radios calling all clear. Sarah's knees buckled. She pressed a hand harder against her chest. Martinez appeared at her side, wide-eyed, face pale under layers of dust. "Captain, you're hit bad. You need a vac." She shook her head, throat raw. "Not until everyone's accounted for." Her soldiers moved among the rubble, pulling comrades to safety, checking for life. Each report came back, alive, wounded but alive. Sarah's world tilted, spinning, her vision narrowing until only fragments remained. Martinez dragging a private with a shattered leg, Corporal Young shouting into the radio, the medic swearing as he tried to stabilize a bleeding sergeant. She had no right to stay conscious, but her stubbornness was stronger than her wounds. She coordinated, ordered, ensured no one was left behind. Finally, when the last soldier was lifted into the Black Hawk, Sarah collapsed into Martinez's arms. She barely registered the medics lifting her onto the stretcher. She remembered the cool rush of air as the helicopter lifted off, the smell of oil and cordite mixing with blood. And then nothing. When she woke, it was not to battle but to fluorescent lights and sterile walls. The field hospital. Her chest was bandaged tight, wires snaking from her skin to machines that beeped in rhythms her heart couldn't keep on its own. A surgeon sat beside her bed, eyes sunken, hands still marked with blood. His voice was steady, professional, but weighted. "You're lucky, Captain. The shrapnel missed your heart by millimeters. We removed what we could. But some fragments are too close to major arteries. We can't risk it. You'll carry them. Forever." She remembered staring at the ceiling, the words heavy as stone. Carry them. Forever. Not just the metal, the weight of it, the reminder, the limitation. He said it like it was simple fact. But for Sarah, it felt like a death sentence. Not of life, but of self. She was a soldier, a leader. What use was she if her body betrayed her? The weeks that followed blurred. Painkillers dulled the agony but left her floating in half-real dreams. Nurses came and went. Martinez visited once, eyes wide with guilt, blaming himself for not spotting the device sooner. She told him firmly it wasn't his fault. She didn't believe it herself, but she wouldn't let him carry that weight. Every day she fought two battles, one with her body, the other with her mind. The body resisted healing, stiff with scar tissue, lungs stubbornly weak. The mind resisted hope, whispering doubts, telling her she was finished. But she refused to quit. She pushed herself harder than her doctors advised. Each stretch, each breath, each painful step across the sterile hospital floor became its own mission. She remembered the looks the staff gave her, surprise, irritation, sometimes quiet admiration. She had a soldier's pride, and that pride didn't let her surrender. When she was finally cleared to return to duty, months later, it was with conditions: modified training, careful monitoring. Officially, her medical file carried red stamps, lines of caution. Unofficially, her superiors decided her story was best kept quiet. The mission had been classified, details buried under layers of need to know. Her injury, best left unspoken, for morale, for optics, for simplicity. She agreed at the time it was easier. No questions, no pity, just silence. But silence had its cost. Now back on the training ground, as the scar caught the sun and every soldier's eyes, Sarah realized she had been carrying that silence like another wound. Hiding it every day, buttoning it beneath fabric and formality. Pretending she was whole when she was. Pretending her weakness wasn't real. The scar had freed her in a way. Terrifying, yes. Humiliating, maybe, but freeing. Around her, soldiers still stood frozen in silence, their salutes raised, their eyes steady. Martinez's hand trembled at his brow, but his gaze never left hers. She saw in his eyes something she hadn't felt in months. Not pity, not doubt. Understanding. Colonel Harrison's voice returned at last, stripped of bluster, hollow with shame. "Captain, I was wrong." The words hung fragile in the air, not enough, not yet, but a start. Sarah closed her jacket slowly, each button fastened with deliberate care. Not to hide the scar again, but to remind herself. She could choose when to show it. It didn't control her, not anymore. She straightened, her voice calm. "The scar isn't weakness, Colonel, it's proof. Proof I gave everything I had, and proof I'll keep giving until I can't anymore." The field was still, even the wind seemed to pause. And in that silence, Sarah felt something shift. She was no longer hiding, no longer pretending. She was standing as herself, wounded, yes, but whole in the ways that mattered most. The soldiers didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their silence, their salutes, their eyes all said enough. For the first time in months, Sarah let herself breathe deeply, even through the ache. The scar hurt, but it no longer shamed her. Why did the silence feel heavier than any battlefield she had walked? Sarah stood at the center of the training field, jacket half fastened, scar hidden once more beneath fabric, but the image remained burned into every mind that had seen it. For the soldiers who circled her, the air still vibrated with the shock of revelation. Some looked stricken, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. Others stood straighter, their eyes sharpened with newfound respect. None looked at her the same way. Colonel Harrison's face told its own story. His colorless lips pressed tight, jaw muscles clenched in shame. A man who had built his career on the certainty of his judgment suddenly found himself stripped of it. He had mocked her, torn into her in front of everyone, confident he was right. And now, the scar had proven him catastrophically wrong. For once, the colonel's booming voice failed him. He had nothing to shout, no thunder left to throw. When he spoke, the words crawled out quieter than Sarah had ever heard from him. "I didn't know." He stared at her like a man seeing something he had never believed possible. His eyes kept drifting back to her chest, as if he could still see the scar through the jacket, as though he needed to remind himself it was real. Sarah's reply was steady, controlled. "No, you didn't. And that's the point, Colonel. You didn't ask. You didn't want to know. Easier to assume weakness than to understand sacrifice." The words weren't cruel. They weren't meant to humiliate him the way he had humiliated her. They were simple truth, spoken with the quiet weight of someone who had carried too much for too long. Around them, the soldiers shifted. Martinez lowered his salute slowly but didn't drop his gaze. His eyes shimmered with guilt but also something else, resolve. He had seen his captain at her weakest, and it hadn't diminished her. It had made her larger than life. A murmur rippled through the circle, soldiers exchanging looks that spoke volumes without sound. Respect, reverence, and yes, shame. Shame that they had doubted even for a moment. Colonel Harrison seemed to shrink inside his own uniform. His chest still broad, his bearing still military sharp, but his authority fractured. His soldiers weren't watching him anymore. They were watching her. For Sarah, the weight that had pressed on her shoulders for months seemed to lift, piece by piece. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't wanted this. But now that it had happened, there was relief in the honesty of it. The secret no longer gnawed at her in silence. The scar was out in the open, no longer something she had to protect others from seeing. Her hand lingered over the last button of her jacket. She pressed it closed, exhaled deeply, and for the first time in months her breath didn't feel like a lie. The colonel's mouth opened again, faltering. "Captain, I owe you an apology. I misjudged you, badly." His words cracked, softer than the gravel under his boots. "You deserved respect, not doubt, and I failed in that." Sarah tilted her head slightly. His apology wasn't enough, not yet. Not because she wanted revenge, but because apologies couldn't undo the public wound he had inflicted. Still, she nodded once. "Respect isn't in words, Colonel. It's in how you treat people when you think no one's watching." The words landed like stone dropped into still water. Every soldier present absorbed them. Not a lecture, not defiance, just truth. The colonel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with something Sarah never expected to see. Regret. Real, raw regret. A heavy set of footsteps approached. Major Reynolds, the base medical officer, emerged at the edge of the field, her eyes sharp, scanning the scene like a medic triaging a battlefield. Someone must have called her. She stopped beside Sarah, gaze shifting between her and the colonel. Her voice was low but firm. "I see the truth is out." Sarah met her eyes and saw no judgment there, only concern. Concern and something fiercer, protection. Reynolds had been there through her recovery. She knew the fight Sarah had waged just to get back to standing here in uniform. Reynolds turned to the colonel, her tone cutting steel. "Sir, I cleared Captain Mitchell for return to duty because she earned it. What you just witnessed is not weakness. It's the price of service. And if you can't recognize that," she glanced at the silent ring of soldiers, "then your soldiers already have." The colonel flinched at the words. He nodded once stiff, like a man saluting his own defeat. Sarah touched Reynolds's arm gently, stopping her before she pressed further. "It's enough," she murmured. "He knows now." Reynolds studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. The soldiers remained in place, uncertain if the confrontation was over, but unwilling to step away from the weight of the moment. It felt historic, though no camera filmed it, no reporter would write about it. It was simply theirs, a truth lived and witnessed, not broadcast. Martinez finally broke the silence. His young voice cracked, but his words carried strength. "Ma'am, I never knew I should have." His eyes dropped, shame on his face. "I doubted you." Sarah stepped toward him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You don't owe me an apology, Sergeant. You owe me your best, and you've given me that every day." His eyes lifted, relief flickering through his guilt. She had released him, freed him from the weight of his doubt. The other soldiers seemed to exhale together, as though her words had eased all of them. Respect flooded the air, silent but powerful. Colonel Harrison turned sharply, his face still taut with shame. "Dismissed," he muttered to the crowd, voice quieter than usual. Soldiers obeyed, but slowly, reluctantly, many casting glances back at Sarah as they dispersed. She stood still, watching them go. Each look they gave her was different now. Not the detached acknowledgement of a commanding officer, not the pity of one seen as broken, something else. Admiration tempered with understanding, respect born of truth. The colonel lingered, his shoulders heavy, his eyes darting to Sarah again. He seemed about to speak, then thought better of it and walked off alone. His retreat wasn't victory for her. It was consequence for him. Reynolds remained. She waited until the field was empty before speaking. "You didn't have to show them, you know. You could have kept hiding." Sarah's jaw tightened. Her gaze dropped to the ground. "I couldn't, not anymore. Not when my silence made them doubt. Doubt spreads fast, and if I let it, it would have poisoned everything I've built." Reynolds nodded, her expression softening. It was brave, costly but brave. Sarah exhaled, a trembling laugh breaking through. "Funny thing about bravery, it never feels brave when you're the one doing it. It just feels necessary." They stood together for a moment, the morning sun climbing higher, the air carrying the faint sound of drills from other parts of the base. Sarah finally turned to go, her boots crunching softly on gravel. Her body ached, her scar burned, but her chest felt lighter than it had in months. The secret was gone. The weight lifted. The truth had cost her, but it had also freed her. Later in her quarters, Sarah sat alone. She removed her jacket carefully, folded it with ritual precision, and placed it on the chair. In the mirror across from her, the scar stared back, angry and jagged, running like lightning from her shoulder to her heart. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the uneven path. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. It was not shame, it was not weakness, it was simply her. And tomorrow, when she faced her soldiers again, she knew they would not look at her the same way. And that was the beginning of something new. Why did the days feel different now? even when nothing had changed. The same gravel crunched under her boots. The same barracks stood gray against the Tennessee sky. The same cadence of morning drills echoed across Fort Campbell, steady and sharp as always. But for Sarah Mitchell, everything felt altered, as though the world itself had shifted half a step to the left. 3 days had passed since the scar was revealed. 3 days since silence broke on that field, and the truth she had hidden for months became the air everyone breathed. She had expected stares, whispers, pity, but what came instead unsettled her in a way she hadn't predicted: respect. Not the hollow kind that clings to rank, but the quiet, unspoken kind that followed her into every room. Soldiers who once glanced past her now met her eyes. Younger recruits straightened in her presence, not because protocol demanded it, but because they wanted to. At the training grounds, Sergeant Martinez walked beside her with a new posture. His movements were sharper, his confidence steadier. But beneath it all, she saw the guilt he still carried. He watched her more closely now, not out of doubt, but with a readiness that said he would never again mistake her silence for weakness. And then there was Colonel Harrison. His presence still loomed at drills, still barked at soldiers when their formation faltered, but the thunder in his voice no longer struck the same chord. He had changed in subtle ways, ways only Sarah noticed. His eyes lingered longer on his troops, softer somehow, as if weighing his judgments before unleashing them. When he looked at her, it wasn't disdain anymore. It wasn't even apology. It was something closer to searching, as if he was trying to understand her in a way he never had before. Sarah wasn't sure what unsettled her more: his earlier cruelty or this quiet transformation. On the 5th morning, Harrison approached her directly. The sun was still low, the soldiers gathered in formation. She stood at ease, her mind already bracing for another confrontation, though part of her doubted he would dare. "Captain Mitchell," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "Sir," she answered evenly. "I owe you more than an apology." His eyes flicked to the soldiers around them. "But words aren't enough, not after what I did." She said nothing, waiting. He shifted, his jaw tight. "I built my command on strength, or what I thought was strength, intimidation, fear. It got results, but it also blinded me." He paused, and for the briefest second, Sarah thought she saw the weight of years pressing into him. "I misjudged you, and worse, I taught others to misjudge what strength really means." His voice cracked at the end, but he caught it quickly, straightening his shoulders again. "I'll spend what time I have left fixing that, starting with how I lead." Sarah studied him carefully. The colonel was not a man used to exposing weakness, not even this sliver. His apology wasn't about absolution, it was about survival, his own moral survival. He had seen himself reflected in her scar, and he hadn't liked what stared back. She gave a small nod. "Then start by remembering that strength isn't loud, sir. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it hides in scars you don't see." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply, like a man receiving orders. And without another word, he turned back to his soldiers. Sarah didn't feel triumph. She didn't want it. She felt something quieter: closure. That night, alone in her quarters, she sat with the weight of the past week pressing down. The scar still burned faintly under her shirt, a reminder that the wound was never fully healed. But she realized something had shifted inside her. For months, she had lived with dread, the dread of discovery, of exposure, of pity. That dread had shaped her days, curled like smoke around her every thought. Now it was gone. In its place was something she hadn't expected: freedom. It wasn't the freedom of being whole again. Her body still betrayed her. She still struggled with tasks that once came easily. Some mornings, pain laced through her chest so sharp it stole her breath. That hadn't changed. But she no longer carried the secret alone. The truth was out, and in its raw exposure she had found a strange kind of strength. The next week, during a squad run, Sarah set her own pace. Slower than the others, yes, but steady, purposeful. And when she reached the finish line behind them, something remarkable happened. Instead of waiting in silence, her squad clapped her across the back. One after another, no mockery, no pity, just solidarity. Martinez jogged beside her the last stretch, his breath ragged. "Ma'am," he said between gasps, "I'll run at your pace any day." She smiled, small but genuine. "Then keep up, Sergeant." Later at the mess hall, whispers no longer cut her. They weren't whispers of doubt anymore. They were whispers of awe, of admiration. She overheard one young private tell another, "That's Captain Mitchell. She took shrapnel in Kandahar and kept fighting." His tone carried reverence, not gossip. The story had spread. She hadn't told it. She didn't need to. The soldiers who had witnessed the moment had carried it across the base like wildfire. And in every retelling, her scar became less of a secret and more of a lesson. Harrison felt the ripple too. His leadership began to change. Less shouting, more listening. Less assumption, more patience. The transformation wasn't overnight, but Sarah could see it. The man who once broke soldiers with words now tried, haltingly, to build them up. It was strange, unsettling, to know she had been the catalyst. Her scar had done what nothing else had, cracked through his iron armor. And yet she still battled herself. Late at night, when the base quieted, when boots no longer stomped across concrete and voices no longer carried down the halls, Sarah would lie awake, hand pressed against her chest. The scar wasn't just tissue. It was memory. Memory of dust and fire. Memory of the faces of her soldiers in Kandahar. Memory of the weight of duty pressing her upright when her body had begged her to fall. Some nights she still woke in a sweat, lungs tight, convinced she was back in the compound with smoke filling her mouth. In those moments the scar wasn't a symbol, it was a prison. But when dawn came, when she rose and buttoned her jacket, she remembered the eyes of her soldiers on the training field, the salutes raised, the silence of respect. And she chose, again and again, to let the scar speak as strength instead of shame. Major Reynolds checked on her more often now, quietly proud but also vigilant. She adjusted Sarah's training program, easing strain without easing standards. Sarah accepted the modifications without guilt now. She no longer felt like a fraud doing less than others. She knew her limits and she knew her worth. The base itself shifted in small ways. Younger soldiers who once flinched under Harrison's voice now carried themselves taller, emboldened by Sarah's example. Rumors that once fueled doubt now fueled inspiration. The culture was changing, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. One evening, as the flag lowered with the setting sun, Sarah stood among her soldiers and felt something she hadn't in months: peace. Not complete, not permanent, but real. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the wind brush against her face, and thought of Kandahar, of the blast, of the stretcher, of the surgeon's tired eyes. She thought of how far she had come since that day. And she thought of the lesson her scar whispered every time she looked at it. Strength was never about perfection. It was about persistence, about standing when standing hurt, about carrying scars not as chains but as proof you had survived. When she opened her eyes again, she found Martinez watching her. He gave a small nod. She returned it. And in that simple exchange, she knew she was no longer carrying this alone. Why did words spread faster than orders ever could? Sarah hadn't spoken of the moment on the training field, hadn't written a report or shared details outside her unit. But secrets in the military never stay sealed when they hold the weight of truth. The scar, once hidden, had become a story retold in barracks whispers and mess hall conversations. By the second week, the incident had traveled farther than she imagined. Not as gossip, no one dared diminish it, but as a kind of parable. Soldiers repeated it to one another like a reminder, a warning, even a lesson. Don't assume you know what someone carries. Sarah noticed the shift when she walked into a briefing room and conversation hushed, not in awkwardness but in quiet respect. Younger officers straightened their posture. NCOs gave her space at the table, not because of rank, but because they wanted her voice first. Colonel Harrison felt it too. He moved differently now. His tone had softened in ways subtle but undeniable. He still barked orders, still demanded discipline, but the edges had dulled. The intimidation that once defined him had lost its force. He was no longer the center of every room Sarah was. And that did not go unnoticed. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a summons she hadn't expected, a meeting with the base commander, formal, unusual. She arrived early, as always. Her jacket immaculate, her bearing steady, though her stomach tightened. She had faced warlords and ambushes with less dread than she felt walking into that office. Major General Patricia Williams sat behind the desk. Her reputation preceded her, a sharp strategist, tough as steel, yet known for listening more than she spoke. Her presence carried weight without raising a voice. "Captain Mitchell," she greeted, eyes sharp, studying her as though she could see past the uniform. "Sit." Sarah obeyed back straight. The general leaned forward. "I've heard about what happened on the training field. I've heard it from 3 different officers, and none of their stories matched exactly. But they all agreed on one thing: you changed something that morning." Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't wanted her scar to be anyone's symbol. "Ma'am," she began carefully, "I didn't set out to change anything. I just couldn't stay silent anymore." Williams's gaze softened slightly. "That's exactly why it matters." She paused, letting the silence draw weight. "The Army needs stories like yours, Captain, not to glorify wounds, but to remind us that strength doesn't always look the way we think it does. You've shown that." Sarah shifted in her seat, unease prickling at her spine. "With respect, ma'am, I didn't want this attention. I just wanted my soldiers to understand." The general nodded slowly. "I understand, but leadership isn't about what you want, it's about what others need. And right now, others need your example." Sarah let the words sink in, heavy and unwelcome. She thought of the long months of silence, the shame of hiding, the pain of exposure. To imagine her scar becoming something larger, something discussed at higher levels, it felt like being stripped bare all over again. But the general's eyes held hers with unflinching steadiness. "I'm not asking you to parade your wounds, Captain. I'm asking you to speak truth, quietly, honestly, the way you did that morning." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. She thought of Martinez, his trembling salute. She thought of Harrison, his broken apology. She thought of the way whispers had turned from doubt to reverence. Finally, she nodded. "If it helps others carry their scars, I'll do it." William smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came rarely from a general. "Good, because I intend to see your story reach further than this base." When Sarah left the office, the sunlight felt heavier on her shoulders than her pack ever had. That night, she sat in her quarters staring at the scar in the mirror again. The idea of it being known beyond Fort Campbell unsettled her. This mark was hers, intimate, carved into her body by fire and steel. Could she bear the weight of it becoming more than personal, of it becoming a lesson for strangers? Her hand traced the jagged line, and she remembered the surgeon's words, "You'll carry them forever." Perhaps this was part of carrying, not just the pain, not just the memory, but the meaning. The days that followed moved with strange duality. On the training field, Sarah was still Captain Mitchell, giving orders, adjusting drills, mentoring younger soldiers. In meetings, she became something else, a symbol, quietly referenced in discussions about leadership, resilience, and the culture of the Army itself. Colonel Harrison remained changed. Once, he might have resented the shift in attention, but instead he seemed humbled by it. More than once, Sarah caught him watching her from a distance, as though trying to understand how one scar had undone decades of his iron rule. One evening, as drills concluded, Harrison approached her. Not as a superior, not as a judge, but as a man weighed by conscience. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking about that day, about my words. I realized something." Sarah turned to him, cautious. "What's that, sir?" He looked past her for a moment to the soldiers laughing as they stacked gear. "Fear was my weapon. I thought if I broke them down enough, they'd harden. But what I saw that morning, it wasn't fear that moved them. It was respect. Respect for you, for your truth. That's something I never gave them. And I see now it's stronger than fear ever was. Sarah didn't respond right away. His words didn't erase what he had done, but they revealed a shift she never thought possible. Respect lasts longer than fear, she said at last. Fear disappears the moment you're gone. Respect stays when you're not in the room. Harrison nodded slowly, the truth of it etched across his lined face. Later in the mess hall, Sarah found herself approached by soldiers she hadn't mentored directly. A young private, barely out of training, stopped her with nervous eyes. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet, "I just wanted to say thank you for what you showed us. It made me realize my own scars, they don't make me less." He pulled back his sleeve slightly, revealing a faded burn scar curling up his forearm. "I always thought I had to hide it, but now," he trailed off, struggling for words. Sarah placed a hand gently on his arm. "Scars don't make us less, Private. They remind us we're still here, still fighting." His eyes watered as he nodded, then straightened, saluting before walking off. Sarah sat alone afterward, her meal untouched, thinking about what had just happened. For months she had believed her scar was a burden to hide. Now it was becoming something else, a bridge. The next morning she received orders for travel. Washington wanted her story, not for press, not for spectacle, for policy, for shaping how the Army understood and supported soldiers who carried visible and invisible wounds. The thought chilled her. To sit in a Pentagon office, scar bared in words, not flesh, was a battlefield of its own. But she knew she would go, not for herself. For them, the soldiers who looked at her differently now, the ones who needed permission to carry their scars with pride. As she packed, her fingers brushed the edge of the scar again. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer. Not weakness, proof. And for the first time, she believed it completely. Why did the city feel heavier than the war zone? Washington wasn't foreign to Sarah. She had walked its streets before, on brief visits, on ceremonial duties, in uniforms polished to perfection. But this trip was different. The city didn't feel like marble monuments and waving flags. It felt like walls of glass and eyes that saw through you, searching for truths you didn't want to give. The Pentagon loomed as her transport pulled through the gates. A fortress, but not of sandbags and razor wire, of bureaucracy, of policy, of unseen battles waged with pens instead of rifles. And she, a captain with a scar across her chest, had been called into its chambers not for discipline, not for assignment, but for something far stranger, to tell her story. Her boots clicked on the polished floor as an aide guided her through endless corridors. Everything smelled of paper and polish, nothing like dust and cordite. Her heart pounded harder here than it had on patrol. They led her into a briefing room. Not a battlefield map, not radio chatter, not the smell of sweat and adrenaline. Instead, suits and uniforms. Generals in starched blues, civilians with notepads, advisors leaning forward, eyes sharp, curious, waiting. Captain Mitchell, the chair of the session, greeted. "Thank you for coming, please sit." She lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table. Her jacket pressed tight across her shoulders, each button fastened with deliberate precision. Beneath, the scar burned faintly, as if reminding her of what she was about to unveil, not in flesh this time, but in words. One of the generals leaned forward, hands folded. "We've read summaries of your case. We've heard reports of the incident at Fort Campbell, but we want to hear it from you. Tell us what happened. Tell us what it meant." Sarah inhaled slowly. The room blurred at the edges. She had spoken before to squads, to comrades, to soldiers who knew the sting of shrapnel and the sound of gunfire. But here, these weren't fighters. These were decision-makers, policy shapers, the ones who decided what scars mattered and which ones were ignored. Her voice came low, deliberate, each word weighed like ammunition. "In Kandahar, I led a squad after a high-value target. We had intelligence, we had preparation, but we missed something. An IED. The explosion threw me into a wall, shrapnel tore through my chest. I kept fighting. I kept leading. I refused evacuation until my squad was clear. The words filled the room, quiet but sharp. No one moved. I survived, barely. Surgeons removed what they could. Some fragments remain. The scar across my chest is permanent. The pain is daily, but I returned to duty. I wanted to serve. I didn't want to be defined by my wound. Her breath caught, she steadied it. But the truth followed me. At Fort Campbell during a fitness test I collapsed. Colonel Harrison accused me publicly of weakness, of excuses. I stayed silent until I couldn't anymore. That's when I revealed the scar. That's when they finally understood. Silence followed, thick as smoke. A civilian advisor broke it. "Captain, you shouldn't have had to do that. Your medical condition should have been known." Sarah shook her head slightly. It was classified for morale, for security, for appearances, and I agreed at first. But hiding it almost broke me. It broke trust with my soldiers. That's worse than any scar. Another general leaned in, his voice softer than expected. "And when you showed them?" Sarah's eyes lowered briefly, remembering. The circle of soldiers, the gasps, the silence that turned to respect. Martinez's trembling salute. They stopped doubting me. They started seeing me, not as broken, as whole in a different way. Her words landed heavy and she let them. She didn't rush to fill the silence. The silence itself was proof. Finally, General Williams, the same one who had summoned her weeks earlier, spoke. "Captain Mitchell, your story is not just personal, it's systemic. Too often we demand silence from our wounded. We treat scars like weakness. But you've shown they can be strength. That silence harms more than it helps." Sarah shifted in her seat, unease prickling her chest. "With respect, ma'am, I'm not a symbol. I'm just a soldier who got hurt and kept going. That's it." Williams's gaze softened. "That's exactly why you are a symbol." The words sank like a stone. Sarah looked down at her hands, scar tissue tingling beneath fabric. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted her pain to be anyone's lesson. But here it was, reshaping conversations far above her pay grade. The session continued. Questions came about policy, about accommodations, about how to balance readiness with humanity. Sarah answered each, steady, factual, never embellishing. She didn't dress herself as hero. She simply told the truth. By the end, the room sat quieter, more reflective. Generals who had entered with steel faces now looked unsettled. Advisors scribbled notes furiously. Something had shifted. As she rose to leave, General Williams stood as well. She extended her hand. "Thank you, Captain. You've given us more than testimony. You've given us perspective." Sarah shook her hand firmly. Her heart hammered, but her voice remained calm. "If my scar changes anything, then it wasn't just mine to carry." That night in the sterile quiet of her Pentagon quarters, Sarah sat at the desk, staring at the scar in the mirror once again. But this time, she didn't trace it with doubt. She traced it with resignation and maybe, just maybe, acceptance. She thought of Kandahar, of Harrison, of Martinez, of every soldier who had looked at her differently since that day. And now of these generals, these decision-makers who had seen in her what she hadn't wanted to show. The scar was no longer just hers. It had become part of something larger. And the weight of that realization both terrified her and steadied her. When she finally lay down to sleep, she whispered to herself, barely audible. "Not weakness, proof for them, for me." The words weren't just a reminder anymore. They were a vow. Why did the ceremony feel more dangerous than combat? Sarah had faced ambushes, raids, midnight firefights under skis lit by tracer rounds. Yet when she stood on the parade field weeks after Washington, the weight of her uniform pressed heavier than her body armor ever had. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a stage, and every soldier's eyes were on her. The sun cut clean across Fort Campbell, Tennessee wind carrying the flag high above. Rows of soldiers stood at attention. The brass gleamed on their uniforms, the air taut with silence broken only by the snapping fabric of the flag. General Patricia Williams herself had flown in for the ceremony. She stepped to the podium, her presence commanding without effort. Her words rang clear across the assembly. "We gather not to glorify wounds, but to honor courage." Captain Sarah Mitchell carried a scar not as weakness, but as proof of sacrifice, proof of strength, proof of what it means to serve when it would be easier to walk away. Sarah stood at attention, eyes fixed forward, but her scar burned beneath the jacket as if it knew it was being spoken of. Captain Mitchell did not seek recognition, Williams continued. She did not parade her pain. She chose silence until silence became heavier than truth. And in revealing that truth, she reminded us all that scars do not make us less. They make us more. The general stepped forward. An aide handed her the medal. The commendation was read aloud, every syllable etching itself into the morning air. For exceptional service, personal courage, and steadfast leadership under duress, Captain Sarah Mitchell is hereby commended. The medal was pinned to her chest. Applause broke across the field, not raucous, not theatrical, but steady, reverent, heartfelt. Sarah's throat tightened. She had dreamed once of such moments, of ceremonies where her name was spoken with honor. But this felt different. Not triumph, not pride, something quieter, something heavier, because she knew what it had cost. Her eyes drifted across the crowd. Martinez stood in the front row, chin high, pride radiating through his young face. Behind him, the soldiers who had once doubted her now stood with unwavering respect. She saw in their faces not pity, not awe, but recognition. They knew what it meant to carry wounds unseen and to keep standing anyway. Even Colonel Harrison was there. His salute was crisp, his posture perfect, but his eyes betrayed him. They glistened faintly, heavy with regret and something resembling gratitude. He did not speak, but his presence was its own confession. When the applause faded, Sarah was dismissed. She walked off the field with slow, steady steps, the medal catching sunlight, the scar beneath her jacket pressing faintly against fabric. That evening the base returned to its rhythm. Soldiers trained, boots thudded against dirt, orders barked across fields. But Sarah sat alone in her quarters, the medal placed on her desk untouched. She unbuttoned her jacket, folded it neatly, and set it aside. In the mirror, her undershirt clung to her skin. She pulled it free and stood bare before her reflection. The scar glared back at her, jagged, raised, unignorable. For months she had hated it. For months she had hidden it. For months it had been her prison. Now it was something else. Not beautiful, not noble, but honest. Her fingers traced the uneven line from shoulder to heart. Each ridge, each twist, each discolored patch told a story she no longer needed to hide. Her mind drifted back to Kandahar, to the dust, to the fire, to the moment she thought she would never rise again. She remembered the faces of her squad, the relief in Martinez's eyes when he saw her breathing, the way her voice had carried orders even when her lungs had failed her. She thought of Harrison's words, cruel and cutting, and of his silence broken only by apology. She thought of the generals in Washington, their faces unsettled, their pens scratching policy into motion. She thought of the private in the mess hall, sleeve rolled back to reveal his own scar, eyes wet with gratitude when she told him he wasn't less. And she thought of herself, the woman who had carried silence like a burden, and the woman who had let it go. The medal gleamed on the desk, the scar gleamed in the mirror. One was polished, official, recorded in files and orders. The other was raw, permanent, written into her flesh. Between them lay the truth of her service. She whispered to herself, the words steady, no longer fragile. Not weakness, proof. Outside, the flag snapped in the evening wind. Soldiers laughed faintly in the distance. Life went on, as it always did. But inside, Sarah felt a quiet completion. Not triumph, not finality, but peace enough for tonight. She knew the scar would ache tomorrow. She knew doubts would creep back in the dark hours. She knew being seen as a symbol carried its own weight. But she also knew she would carry it because scars don't vanish. They live with you, and sometimes they teach others how to live too. The night settled soft around her. She buttoned her jacket once more, the scar hidden but no longer silenced. She turned off the light, stood for a moment in the quiet, and let the final truth wash over her. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that, Captain Sarah Mitchell walked forward, scar, strength, silence and all.